Hey, it's Katie Moran,
And MJ Coppola.
and we are sharing an 11-part mindful mental health miniseries called RNTKY, sharing 11 reasons not to kill yourself. It started as a blog post, YouTube video, and now a Discord community where we host gratitude challenges. Episodes will be coming out Tuesdays and Thursdays between Thanksgiving and New Year's Day. Today we have a very special episode. This is one of my favorite ones. It's There Are People You've Never Met Before. And this is special to me because specifically I had shared this list with a friend. I think it might have been in the video form, and she told me she was having a hard time over the weekend, and she really clung on to this one reason, and that there were people she hadn't met, and it just meant so much to me that she would share that with me and that it made an impact on her. And that's why I love sharing this one. And for me, this is one of the most important ones because I think about all the people I love now, all the people who are in my life, all the people who I've shared so many memories with. And just to think that none of them would have ever met me if I was successful at my suicide attempts. And it breaks my heart, but also it makes me so happy that I get the chance to know them and that I can also be there to impact other people. And the very the very just the it's so important to me that I have gotten to know my nieces and nephews, and thinking about how I never would have met them because my suicide attempts were before they were born. It is really moving to me. And I remember last Christmas, me and my family and my sister and our kids went to New York City, and we went shopping for the holidays. And my one of my nieces, she said she would only hold my hand and that she wouldn't hold anyone else's hand when we were crossing the street and when we were on the street. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, that's so sweet. And then everyone was saying, good thing she's here. And it just meant something so much deeper to me because I thought about, like, what if I hadn't been there, and what if she never had met me? And it just breaks my heart because I think of people who've passed on that I never got to know, and there's such a loss there, and it just means so much to me that I could be there to get to know them. And all the time I'll spend time with them, and I'll always think to myself just how grateful I am that I'm here to actually be able to spend that time with them. And this happens like every time I get close with someone, every time I love someone, I think about just if I hadn't been here and all the things I would have missed if I was successful at my suicide attempts. And it's so meaningful to me that now I'm grateful to be alive after I had those attempts and after I was suicidal for so long. And it's so important that I would like to share that with everyone, that you can go from hopeless to really grateful to be alive. And feeling hopeless is not an indication of how you'll feel forever. And you can really go from one side of the spectrum to another. And there's a lot of work in the middle of that. And there's a lot of living to be done in the middle of that. And even when things get worse, life is still worth living. And that's one of the most powerful lessons that I've learned in the last decade.
Yeah, this one is really powerful to me. It's it brings up something that you say, or that I've learned from you. It's that invisible impact thing. Like we have no idea, um, a lot of times, like what kind of impact we have on people. And, if you weren't there, man, even like this conversation, meeting you, I maybe never would have published my poetry books. I would have never maybe, like picked up my own like creative practice again if you didn't exist. Like, I think about my daughter, that there was a period of time where she left to be at her dad's to go back to school. And my last episode was after that. And I was blessed with having her stay with me for the last like 9 months this year, and I would have never been able to reacquaint myself with this version of her if it was, if I had left. Even like the people who are in our lives, it always seems to happen, like those moments where, at least for me, like I realize that there's a chance, or like I would have never been in this moment. And a lot of times it's like when I'm really in a joyful moment, like one of the examples of that is I was at with a friend of mine and his son, and we were at like a roller coaster kind of place, and we were standing in line for this roller coaster and just had this like really strong feeling of like joy, and at the same time it was like, this, in some reality somewhere, this doesn't exist because I'm not here. And it was like this, so it was sad, but it was just this like moment of intense presence, because I realized that like there are people out there that aren't experiencing maybe the most joyful times of their life, because they decided that it was hopeless for the rest of it. And it's not. Like I think back at all of the times where I felt that way, especially the last time that I felt that way, sitting there in this really dark room in the middle of nowhere, feeling like there's, just no hope. There's like no point. And the very next day, the sun was out, and I took my dog for a walk, and, and at that moment, the dog was the reason why, like, I was here. Like, and there's no wrong answer for staying. There just is a reason for staying. That's all.
Yeah, I remember after my suicide attempts, most of them were at night, and I would wake up the next morning, and I remember I would just be like, why am I still here? And I'm like so grateful that the last decade of my life, I feel like, has been answering that question. And that is just so meaningful every time someone says I impacted them or made some difference in their life. That's again for me just like an answer to that question. And it felt so hopeless. I felt so empty when I would ask myself that question. And I really didn't think there was any purpose for why I would be here. And just to think now that literally every day, multiple times a day, I have answers to that question is something that I don't take for granted. And I think it's so common to take all the good stuff for granted in life, all the things you've always had. And I think if there was one emotion I could bottle up and give to people, it would be an overwhelming sense of gratitude. And I always think to myself, just kind of like that feeling of being grateful to be alive and to have the opportunities I have just because I'm alive is so meaningful to me. And sometimes I'll go for walks and I'll just be overflowed with this feeling of immense gratitude, overwhelming gratitude that it usually brings me to tears. And I think about even just like having my freedom. I've been hospitalized before, and I was considered for a commitment at like a long-term care facility. And I just think to myself, I was in the hospital for about a month and I never went outside. And now I go for walks at the beach almost every day. And it's so powerful to think that I thought there was a chance I'd never be able to even date again. Like I thought I wouldn't be able to date in like a long-term care facility, and just to like have the opportunity to get my heart broken. I think a lot of times people think it's so horrible, but I mean, just to have that freedom is something that I think a lot of people take for granted. And I think there's beauty even in the pain when you go from a place where you don't have opportunity to a place where you get to really feel it. And I always ask people, if there's one emotion they could bottle up and give to people, what would it be? So I'm curious, what would yours be?
Oh gosh. It's funny you say freedom, because freedom is like like one of my core 5 values. Like a lot of people know that I do that practice like at least twice a year. I go over and, practice, go through and ask myself what my core values is. Freedom is it, because it's super important to me. And honesty definitely is the second one. Radical honesty. Freedom. Because man, the freedom to choose is so powerful. Not only like physical things, but the freedom to choose how you feel, the freedom to choose like the direction, the freedom to choose, well, to stay or to go, like all of that. There's freedom in that. And that freedom in itself is like one of, in my eyes, like one of the most powerful things you can have, and what sets us apart from so many other things in this world.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember. And that feeling of freedom is something that I think is really powerful. And I think for a lot of people who are suicidal, they feel like that's been taken from them. And like when I like after being hospitalized, I became suicidal again because it was hard going back on medication. And I think some of it was just side effects of the medication, because it takes about a year to stabilize. But I think it's so important to recognize just how much freedom we have, like if we're able to go outside. And I know one of the other reasons is nature never judges and nature only accepts. And that's one of the most powerful ones for me, because I feel like if someone has nothing left, like they still have nature. And that was like so important for me because I felt so many times before like I might not ever be able to go outside again, or not be able to go outside without supervision. And just I know it sounds so absurd, and I think people who know me now can't imagine that I was ever in a state that it was that bad. But I like stopped eating, I stopped sleeping, I stopped showering. My hair was really dark colored, and I'm like blonde naturally, so it's like it was just like I looked like a brunette. And it was interesting because I just like was too afraid to shower, and I was so terrified all the time, and I thought I was constantly in danger. So it actually brought me a feeling of safety to be in the hospital at that time. But yeah, I think it's so important that we do recognize the freedom that we have, and that Viktor Frankl quote that our reaction is the last freedom we have, and the one that we have no matter what, is one of the most extraordinary things that I think anyone can really recognize in their own life.
Yeah, man, I know we talked about this in the last episode, but the Viktor Frankl's book, really, reading that story at least a couple times, and like I had to go back and actually read it again, that book, because it's so powerful. And I don't think this particular story was in that book, but I remember hearing a story of someone who had been imprisoned and they were in solitary confinement, and the way they made it through their very long stay in solitary and in darkness was they befriended like a rat or something like that. And it was just so, it was like that power of connection was so important that it literally kept them alive. And I think about that, I'm like, okay, connection is so important. And also freedom, that person didn't have to befriend the rat. They could have just like not, just been whatever, but they chose to use what they had and not focus on what they didn't have in that moment. And I think that's where the choice comes from. And it's so beautiful, like, to think that that exists in us, that we can shift our perspective even in the worst of times. um Yeah. I don't remember where that story comes from. I wish I did, because I'd love to read it. If I can remember, I'll put it in the show notes, but
Yeah, I think
it
that's
might have been this
so
story.
beautiful. And I have so many moments now where I just feel like almost a heart-wrenching fear. Like if anything had been different, I wouldn't like be in that exact moment where I feel so much gratitude. And I think it's like almost the opposite of like the feeling of being suicidal, is that you just feel like where you are is exactly where you're meant to be. And I think it's something that's really powerful to say that you can be suicidal and then have that feeling that you were so grateful in the moment that you fear that anything would have been different, and that everything just feels so perfectly aligned. And not that everything's perfect, but that you're grateful for everything that's there, and it feels almost like a perfect moment. And I have a lot of those moments. And a lot of the time when people talk about suicide, I think they say things get better. Um, but I don't think people talk about that things can get a lot better, and that things can almost feel like the opposite of what they were. And sometimes they can get worse, and that in all of it, it's all worth it. It's all worth living.
Mm, very much is. My daughter sent me this message recently with a video of somebody, and this spoke to me really like highly, um, because I recently went through a very major like change in my life, another one, and I moved, just dropped everything, moved, because I had to, but uh, and it felt very like my being felt very foggy. It felt very like I was in the fog all the time, and she just sent me this video that was this guy saying, talking to another version of himself, and there was a fog rolling in, and he's like, it's a shame that the view is leaving. And the guy's like, well, the view is the fog. And he's like, well, it's kind of sad to think like you can't see all the other things, you can only see the whiteness of the fog. And he's like, but inherently we know that there are other things, there are trees and beautiful birds, and even though you can't hear them and even though you can't see it right now, your view is the beautiful fog, but within that fog is mysteries that when the fog finally lifts, when the sun comes out and the heat, makes it go away eventually, like you will get to see those things again. But right now it's enjoying the view that it is. And it was so powerful to have that perspective, because that's kind of how I feel like you are in that moment. Like when I had those moments back in the day where I wasn't sure I wanted to be alive the next day, um it's that's what was the view. It was just fog, and I knew there were other things there inherently, because I know that they're there, but you can't see it. And it was such a one it was a great message to get, because I was like this is a great way to look at it, not even when the fog like lifts, there's still only like, we can only see so far, and then it can bring it back to like there are people and places and everything, there's lots of experiences we've never, we're just not there yet, we're not at a place in our lives where we can see like who else is coming. um so
Yeah, and I think that metaphor of the fog, even just like in fog, sometimes like when you step forward, you can like see more, and you can see like
mhm.
what's within the distance, like that's in your proximity. And I think that's something that's really important to recognize, is that sometimes we feel so lost that we feel paralyzed by it. And it's in taking those steps that we feel that there's more out there. We feel more of a sense of hope, and we have to keep going to find that hope and to create that and to create meaning and really find the supports and protective factors in life that keep us here and that remind us that there's hope and remind us that there's an importance in staying here, and that even if things seem so far away and like you can't see it, that it's just, you have to have faith to keep going and that they're there. And I know for me, when I was suicidal, it felt like the only thing waiting for me was more pain, and the pain was there, but there was just so much more meaning. And when I really started to value myself as someone who was resilient and someone who keeps going and someone who believes in the goodness of people and life, things started to change.
I remember thinking at some point, remembering being like so depressed and sad and feeling like, I remember hearing myself physically say, I want to feel like there are better things. And just that, like physically saying that, even though there was no way at the moment, I was too foggy and too depressed to like bring that to life. But the want was there. And I want to like encourage people to, even if that's all that it feels like is there, that's enough sometimes.
Yeah, and I think kind of like this is something we talked about before, is this idea of suspending negative feelings and like just focusing on getting through the day. And for me, it was like reading, it was watching shows. That was something that helped me get through like each moment to moment. And sometimes it wasn't enough on certain days, but it all worked out. And I always remind people about like, sometimes it's those distractions that we choose to spend time in that really lead us to our purpose and our passions. And from a spark, it can become something that's really powerful that lights the way of where we're meant to go next.
There are characters, not just people. There are characters we haven't met yet.
Yes.
It's a real
I think most of my audience will really resonate with that one, whether they're writers or readers.
How many books haven't been written or read yet
Yes.
that you haven't like experienced like this fantasy character that just doesn't exist yet? It's just that right now makes me want to go like read a book.
Yeah, I just tweeted the other day. I was like, again, I'm crying over fictional characters.
Right.
Because I was writing, it's NaNoWriMo, so I was writing on my manuscript, and I like, it was like 5 minutes in and I like started hysterically crying, because I write a lot of like uplifting tragedies, and a lot of like my nonfiction is uplifting tragedies, so that's just kind of like my genre. And it's just so powerful. I think every time you can kind of like heal through fiction and heal through characters. And then The Color Purple was one of the most transformational books I've ever read, because the main character really goes through a healing journey, and she like owns her truth, and she really becomes a different person at the end of it. And I think in becoming a different person, you realize that's who you always were, and that's how you get through things. And that was, I'm just so, I don't know, so moved by that story. And Alice Walker, the author, and then the movie was incredible. And now the remake is coming out. I think it opens on Christmas Day, so I'm so excited to see that. And every time I watch a trailer, I cry. It still is so moving. And I think a lot of people can relate to this, just like having fictional stories make them cry, whether it's their own or others. I always, every once in a while, ask my audience if they cry writing, and everyone always says that they do, like hundreds of people. And I think it's something we all have in common, is that we are moved by stories, and that's why we share them and we tell them and we believe in them.
Yeah. And it's also why journaling practice for me has been such a huge lifesaver, because it just feels like it's an outlet. It's like a place to put it, and it doesn't have to stay like caged up in this thing up here. And then I could go back later, and even if I can go back later and read it like it is, like a fictional part, not that you want to, but if I wanted to go back and do that, I can still go back and like detach from the fact that that might be myself writing to myself now, and get a different perspective on those feelings. Like when we read books and we read the character, it's like if I read when I read, but if you wrote a novel and I read that, my experience of that character is going to be different than when you wrote it. I think that's so beautiful. And I think that's why, speaking to the audience, probably our audience, that like reading and writing is like so, and especially with fiction, is so important. And even history, because we can look back at those things from a different perspective, as if like, and going back to what we were talking about yesterday, last episode, is this like writing from the scar, not the wound, because it's the perspective of that is just so, it's so important to have like almost a better a more complete picture, because when you're kind of in it, you still haven't like processed all the pieces of it, and sometimes writing can help you process the pieces of it in such a way, but I feel like it always has to come from more of a healed version before we do that, but the perspective is great. So
Yeah, I think it's somewhat important to get to a scar is writing from the wound. I don't write from the wound usually when I put it out. But I write from the wound to get to a place where it's a scar so that I could put it out. And sometimes in writing to send a message to someone, it helps me turn those wounds into scars, and it's very cathartic to do that. And I think there's so much basis in art therapy that is just so powerful. And I think it's something that anyone can do, and I think some people do need to do it with whether be a coach or a mental health professional. I think it's so important that people recognize that their passions can lead them to the things, that purpose, that the purpose that they'll feel life is worth living when they find. And I think so much of it is creating it, getting to a point to recognize what already matters to you, and how can you create more of that and expand that, and how can you use what you're good at to serve other people so that you have that support system when you go through the pain. And that's what I love about the RNTKY community on our Discord, is that when someone goes through something, there's other people who say, I can relate and you're not alone. And sometimes that's just all you need to keep going.
yeah, and I've said this several times and I still stand by it, that even if someone is a observer and not as much of a, a participant, there's still always somebody that will chime in, even if they've never written anything before, and be there for someone who is just looking. RNTKY has been really important to me. Like even when I'm going through times where I'm just having a really rough go and I'm starting to feel the feels, I can like log in and say something, or just say, hey, like this is how I'm feeling today. And even though I don't, you might not always get like an immediate response, that someone's there who will, sympathize or empathize, or even just being able to log into the community it's just, it's great to have. So it's been really helpful. And those are people that I mean, never met those people before, and I feel like in person, and I definitely feel like if I met them on the street, I would give them like the biggest hug. Like some of my favorite people are in that group.
Yeah, it's such a special community. And one of the things I love about it is that there's a lot of people on my social media, and it's hard to keep track of people. It's hard to keep track of comments. But when someone goes into the RNTKY Discord, it's an opportunity to get to know people, and it's an opportunity to get to see what people are going through, to just have a closer interaction with them. And that's one of my favorite things about it, is that it's so personal, and that you really get to know people, and you get to know people's lives and what their joys are and what their struggles are. And it makes you feel less alone, because we're all just in it together.
Yeah, it's quite lovely. It is lovely to have a community. I will say that my advice, rounding out this unsolicited advice, hold space, or a professional or a coach or somebody, some people that will be able to do that. And if you want to start with RNTKY, we're there. So
Yeah, and I always think it's so important to recognize that like our content isn't for therapeutic purposes. It's really to remind people there is hope, and that we speak as mental health advocates and as poets, and not as mental health professionals. And I think it's so powerful to always recognize that there's no replacement for therapy, and really getting the help you need. And in RNTKY, we talk about, if you're there for a crisis, that you need to Google your crisis line that is in your area. So whether that be turning your location on and having it GPS and track where you are and what the number would be. I think it's an easy Google search, but it's so important that we all know we're not in it alone, and that people are rooting for us, even when we aren't rooting for ourselves and it feels too heavy to believe in ourselves. There are people who believe in us.
yes, there will be someone there to hold space for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.